Doom: The Dark Ages is my pick for 2025's Game of the Year, so far at least. However, after finishing my 100% completion run of the game on Nightmare difficulty with a modification to make it more challenging, my love of the game has a shadow, a missed opportunity, one element of the game that I wished were changed. You're watching Rayl Deal Games, and this week, I'll be analyzing Doom: The Dark Ages in depth. And by the end of this video, I'll explain why the game is a genuine gaming marvel, even if it shouldn't be a Doom game. I make new gaming videos every Wednesday and Friday, and if you like this video, consider subscribing and checking out my other and future work. My big goal for this year is 10,000 subscribers, and with you in my community, I know we can get there. I won't be restricting myself from talking about any and every element of this game's content and design, so this is your massive spoiler warning for this whole video. I will be talking about late game areas, bosses, mechanics, and story elements. With all of that established, let's dive right in. A boomer shooter's gameplay is entirely contingent on how fun the core gameplay loop is, and something I've always massively enjoyed about the Doom franchise is the ways in which each subsequent game in the series feels familiar yet completely new. The developers have said that they don't want to make the same game, and they've successfully managed to straddle the line between familiarity and uniqueness with the Dark Ages.
We don't want to make the same game twice. Yeah. So 2016 and Eternal are similar, but they're very different games. Dark Ages looks to stand on its own. You've got a nice trilogy of games, and each one feels different and good in its own way. And in playing the original Doom at the start of the project, as we always do, the answer was there. Like, you can't even jump in the original Doom. Yeah. Most of the action happens along the horizon line.
You can't even look up and down.
That's right.
Yeah. Doom.
And the action all happens along the horizon line, you know, right where my reticle sits. It's really more about moving along the x-axis as opposed to the y. And so that was the focus that showed us a lot, that the movement was really about weaving your way between this maze of slow-moving projectiles as opposed to moving above or under it. And we just went from there.
Each of the modern Doom titles so far have taken an element of boomer shooter game design and overclocked it. In 2016's Doom, it is the expansion of the classic Doom formula that makes the game stand out. In 2020's Doom Eternal, aerial mobility and weapon swapping is the core mechanic the id team focused on, adding complexity and speed to the game. In this year's The Dark Ages, the id team went with a completely different approach. Boomer shooters are centered on the intersection between speed and violence. However, The Dark Ages has found a way to throw something else into the mix: slugging. Instead of outright avoiding damage while also maximizing damage potential, The Dark Ages has a parry mechanic that adds an element of fight selection into the mix. The player is incentivized to aggressively focus on parrying green-colored shots, especially in the middle and latter parts of the game, as parries yield extra benefits for the player, whether it be the added effect of an earthquake or the ever-loving, everlasting evanescence of almighty lightning from the heavens above, smiting the dastardly demons below. Now, I'm a big fan of parries in video games and have been so ever since I played Sekiro back in 2019. This comes with a bit of a caveat though, as I am also picky as to what I consider a good parry system versus a bad one. So where does the Dark Ages fall? Does the mechanical design of the parry mirror the shinobi slashers of Sekiro, or are they more flawed, ham-fisted into the game's design like the parry in Resident Evil 4 Remake? This was a tough question for me to answer, and I considered it throughout the entirety of my playthrough. It's important to note that I turned the parry timing down to the lowest possible setting before I started the game proper, and this, in conjunction with the fact I played exclusively on Nightmare difficulty for the entirety of my 30 hours with the game, definitely impacted my impression of the parry mechanic in The Dark Ages. Personally, with the exact specifications I've outlined for the difficulty tuning of The Dark Ages so far, I find this parry mechanic to be one of the better ones I've experienced in a game. With tight timings, perfection becomes a requirement for the player, and mastering the parry windows for every single attack the demonic hordes of hell can possibly hash out becomes a necessity. Missing one timing is all that separates the player from life and death, and this pressure adds a lot to the gameplay loop of this title. The shield, which can also be used as an offensive stun tool or defensive barrier, is multifaceted in a way that benefits the parry framework of the Dark Ages. Essentially, the player is faced with 4 choices at all times in all microcosms of every murder room: Horde Maelstrom and boss fight. Should they 1. Go for a nice juicy parry on the profligates with a penchant, a predilection for pain; 2. Block damage that could potentially be lethal or otherwise CC or crowd control the player into a disadvantageous position; 3. Send the shield out as if they were a sordid sort of genetic cross between Captain America and Kung Lao to stunlock a particularly devilish demon; or 4. Use the shield bash ability as a slingshot away from danger or right into a new throng of enemies, soon to be minced to meat. Any one of these choices could be the correct one. Likewise, any one of these choices could lead to certain death. And it's up to the player's mastery of the gameplay systems, level layouts, and enemy compositions to determine the correct course of action. This all means that the Dark Ages is a game with a relatively low skill floor and a fairly high skill ceiling, which is the sweet spot games should shoot for. The raw mechanics of this title, the way in which the player, in terms of practicality, actually engages a parry, shoots a gun, or maneuvers within the medieval playspace of the game, is incredibly intuitive and simple to do. It is only when buffing the raw difficulty or changing the modular elements of the Dark Ages design that a true mastery, memorization, and mechanical implementation is required, making it a game that truly appeals to gamers of all skill levels in a way that other games just can't replicate. Not every game needs to be hard, not every game needs to be easy, and not every game needs to appeal to all gamers of all skill levels. However, when a game does manage to hit the center of this sort of Venn diagram, it is something the developers deserve to be applauded for. Historically speaking, id Software is one of the only legacy developers who've managed to pull this sort of synthesis off, and the Dark Ages is another casual W they get to add to their product catalog. They've managed to create a combat system that lands in the middle ground between ranged weapons and melee clashes. It's not like melee range attacks have never existed in Doom, as the chainsaw in the classic Doom games is crazy useful and an excellent way of handling the ammo economy every FPS title needs to get right. However, the Dark Ages creates these situations where the player is in melee range for extended periods of time while also using their ranged weapons, and this situation is created by the conjunction of the parry system and available weapon suite. Unlike previous Doom games, the weapons in the Dark Ages are mostly centered on close to medium range effectiveness for the high power weapons, whereas the weapons that can shoot from long range are significantly weaker. This is different from 2016's Doom and Doom Eternal, where ammo availability and weapon speed created the balance between high and lower power weapons, rather than the raw distance between player and demon. These two things incentivize the player to jump into the middle of a mosh pit of demonic dudes, wheeling and dealing death in ever-expanding concentric circles. Within this context, the Dark Ages is a high-octane and frantic experience, especially at higher difficulty levels and with a reduced parry window. Adding to this, the id team truly cooked with the set of weapons they came up with. I found all of the weapons to be useful in certain situations, but as with any gamer, I did end up having my preferences by the end of my time with the game. The two weapons I found myself coming back to most often were the Ravager and Super Shotgun, comboing these with the Dread Mace and Lightning Strike parry trigger. The Super Shotgun has always been good, ever since it was introduced in Doom 2, but this version of the weapon is definitely one of my favorites. For some demons, the Super Shotgun functions as a one-button pressed jibbing machine, and as such I used it liberally on imp stalkers, acolytes, and revenants. I'll get deeper into my analysis of the individual demons later in this video, but the way revenants work is important to mention now. Revenants are essentially ghosts in the Dark Ages, as they'll become incorporeal periodically. The only way the player can snap them back to reality is if they parry some of their rockets and or parry something with the Lightning Strike trigger equipped. This makes revenants particularly dangerous in throngs of demons since they do demand the player's full attention. However, the Super Shotgun hard counters these guys. When a Revenant first appears, they are in a corporeal state, and with a quick shield bash, the player can explode them with a fresh peppering of double-barreled buckshot. Knocking these things out before they can become invulnerable to damage makes the Super Shotgun a real knockout weapon already, but in general it's just good against the hellish roster of target dummies the Dark Ages provides the player. By the end of my playthrough, my favorite weapon would become the Ravager though, as this thing does a better job at ripping apart every single demon in the game than anything else. Outside of instances where something like the Super Shotgun outright outright one-shot something, while also providing survivability to the player. For example, this weapon is one of the key reasons I was able to completely devastate every boss in the game, as it is essentially permanently overclocked against boss type and leader brand enemies. Against the final boss, the health drops from the weapon were massively important too, being one of the key reasons I was even able to beat the guy. There's very few situations where I found myself needing to use anything else. I still used other things because I'm a variety type of guy, as you can clearly see by the types of videos I make on this channel. I mean, I'm talking about Doom the Dark Ages right now, but I'll be talking about Expedition 33 and the Final Fantasy Magic the Gathering set next month, and after that I'll be talking about Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, Elden Ring Night Rain, Dusk, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4, Ninja Gaiden Ragebound, and Ultimate Sheep Raccoon. I'm just not the type of person that can stick to one weapon for the entire duration of a playthrough. My pick for the most overhyped weapon is the Chain Shot. It's a great, powerful weapon for sure, but it's slow as sin, which makes it a massive liability against colossal boss enemies and leader tier demons if there are other demons around. Its power doesn't make up for the slow speed, especially when the rocket launcher, Ravager, and Super Shotgun kill much quicker without any loss of relative safety, while also providing the player with health pickups, specifically in the rocket launcher and Ravager cases. That being said, I would never criticize someone for saying the Chain Shot is their favorite because it is a satisfying weapon to use. In fact, I can see how any individual weapon in this game could be someone's favorite, and that's exactly why the weapon suite in the Dark Ages is so great. How often is it in a game that every single weapon is fun? I can't speak for everyone, but after playing games for well over 20 years at this point, the list of games that provide such a weapon suite is spectacularly small. There's a certain flow state the best boomer shooters create, and this is something the Dark Ages is more successful at doing than most other games within the same design space. The speed of the game, pace of parries, and click and cock of the weapons, especially the Super Shotgun, sets this game apart from every other FPS game on the market, including ones within its subgenre of boomer shooter and its own franchise. It's this sort of design that makes Doom games timeless, and why people are and will still be playing Doom, Doom 2, Doom 3, Doom 2016, Eternal, and the Dark Ages for as long as their source codes exist. Replayability instead of infinite playability is something I highly value in video games, and this is something else the Dark Ages excels at. You see, I love replaying games under self-made constraints, and for this game, I plan to predetermine which weapons I'm letting myself use for the entire playthrough, which is going to force me to find creative solutions to already solved problems, and to create new combos between the weapons. The strength of the weapon suite and the core mechanics of the gameplay makes this style of play intriguing and exciting, which is part of the reason this game is my current game of the year. Just like with any game though, the Dark Ages does have low moments, and these fall within the sections of the game that take the player away from the awesome combat system, and those are the Dragon and Atlan mech sections. Now, I don't think these sections are bad, and there's a sort of palate cleansing fun to be had with them. However, they aren't as fun as the sections they take the player away from. Essentially, both the Dragon and Atlan sections are kind of like a simplified 3D version of Punch-Out. The inclusion of these sections is worth critiquing, even if I didn't personally mind them all that much myself. I'm pretty indifferent to them being in this game, as they're something I could take or leave. However, that is kind of a ding against the Dark Ages, as the things Doom Eternal does to take the player away from the core loop of boomer shooter demon-destroying fun is one of my biggest criticisms of that game. The Dragon and Atlan sections take longer to complete than the Fortress of Doom sections, which I do like, and the platforming areas in Doom Eternal, which I don't like. As cinematic battle pieces, they're better, and they do a better job at maintaining the pace of gameplay than anything it has ever done to vary the gameplay experience of a modern Doom title. I do wish we'd just get a game closer to Doom 2016 in terms of this design ideology though, as I don't think these distraction matrices are necessary for this franchise. I'd much rather just be in murder rooms the whole time with a brief cooldown jaunt between them, which is actually the core reason I truly like some specific levels in the Dark Ages, but I'll get into that in the level design section of this video. At the end of the day, these Dragon and Atlan sections are inoffensive deviations from the core Doom loop, so I don't hate them, but they needed to be more mechanically dense to make them something worth praising. They exist, they're not bad, but they could have been far more exciting. One thing I am going to praise the Dark Ages for is the lack of a multiplayer mode. Yeah, you heard that right. The multiplayer modes in Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal are not that fun, were never that popular, and always took development resources away from the things that actually matter in a Doom title: the weapon design, demon variety, level layouts, and the atmospheric storytelling. The multiplayer allocation of resources impact on the development of these games is definitely the most obvious in Doom Eternal. However, the lack of the Archvile and Pain Elemental is a clear negative of Doom 2016 as well. Not needing to make a multiplayer mode is the reason the Dragon and Atlan sections exist in the Dark Ages, as the team leads have said themselves in an IGN interview.
Not having a multiplayer this time around and focusing on single player has allowed us to put things like the Atlan and the Dragon in the game to make what we feel like is the largest, most polished campaign we've ever made. So there's so many things in the game. Honestly, maybe even having the shield. I mean, there's just a lot of depth to this experience, and we were able to funnel those resources into the single player campaign, and we're really like happy with the results.
It would have been far better for the Pain Elemental, Archvile, and Summoner to all be in the Dark Ages over these additions in my book. However, these elements of the Dark Ages design are more welcome than the mediocre multiplayer modes of the previous two games. I suspect, too, that the lack of a multiplayer mode allowed the developers to focus more on the difficulty design for the Dark Ages, which very well may have the best difficulty design out of any id game, nay, any boomer shooter ever made. There are a few gaming genres that difficulty design is so crucially important to the identity of that getting it wrong instantly makes the game less good than others within the same space. Boomer shooters, character action games, beat-em-ups, souls-likes, and fighting games are examples of these, and the various teams at id Software over the years have always known this. It doesn't matter if the modern id team is a Ship of Theseus versus the original Carmack Romero era of the company, they all understand the vital importance of difficulty design in games.
You know, challenge is a meaningful part of our engagement loop. So without sacrificing depth, without sacrificing challenge, you know, and you saw with the sliders too, it's like you can just customize this to whatever you want. I mean, you could make it crazy hard, way harder than anything we've made. You could make it super easy. You could strike some balance in between.
Create your own, yeah.
Yeah, we see that a lot in The Office. It's not just everybody turning everything up. Actually, the best players in The Office, they slow down the projectiles and then they make them lethal. So it's like they move even slower, so they're easy to dodge, but if you touch one, you're dead.
Yeah.
It's the thing about Doom titles that have truly added to their universal appeal and creates the power fantasy reviewers and commenters are so fond of bringing up. The power fantasy is universal because the games can be tailored to the exact, minute preferences of the players, while also providing a more difficult way to replay the game, adding to the longevity of the title. For classic Doom, challenge runs and WODs push the difficulty of the games beyond what the base game can provide, and for modern Doom, the permadeath Ultra Nightmare difficulty has taken up this mantle. The Dark Ages does this as well, however the Mad Lads at id also added game modification sliders to give the power of difficulty scaffolding to the player. This is something we've seen companies here or there do over the past couple of years, but none of them have done so as successfully as id have done with the Dark Ages. It helps that this game's mechanics can be easily broken down into separate things to be modified, such as the aggressiveness of the demons, parry window time frame, speed of the game, etc. For my playthrough, I chose to play at Nightmare difficulty with the parry window timing reduced to the absolute minimum. And for those of you who are interested in a decent challenge for your first playthrough, this is what I would suggest. The next time I play, I'll be keeping these settings and be increasing the speed of the game as well. I didn't play with that setting this time around because I was concerned that increasing the game's speed would actually have made parrying easier for me. I know from the Souls series that the attacks I find the hardest to parry are ones with delayed animation. variations, which do exist in the Dark Ages as well. I obviously didn't know that when I set up my difficulty modifiers at the start of my run, but I did speculate it was a possibility. These modifiers can be changed at any time, but I can't do that. If I ever turn down the difficulty of a game, I always know I've failed to complete the task I've set out for myself, which personally just bugs me. However, if you don't have that same mental and emotional quandary, you can just change these settings at any time. It's actually for this reason that I haven't completed my Ultra Nightmare playthrough of the Dark Ages yet, as I can't bring myself to lessen the challenge to make such a thing easy to check off my list. Instead, I satisfied myself for now by getting 100% Steam achievements entirely on Nightmare difficulty with the parry modification. If I am ever blessed to do YouTube full time, I'd definitely be interested in doing a video comparing the Ultra Nightmare difficulty of all 3 modern titles, because permadeath playthroughs are my favorite ways to replay my favorite games. The Dark Ages is more loaded with demons than anything that's ever existed in the Doom franchise, except for slaughter maps, especially Okupluck, and this is one of my favorite things about the game. The only demons not included in the game that I could think of are the Summoner, Archvile, Pain Elemental, Marauder, Spider Demon, and a litany of the typically overlooked Doom 3 demons like the Maledict, Sabioth, Cherub, and so on. However, there are 21 distinct enemy types in the Dark Ages, not counting bosses, demons exclusive to the Dragon and Atlan mech sections, or variants. It would become monotonous for me to go over every single demon, so I'm just going to outline some of my favorite design aspects for a few select ones. Starting out, the Agadon Hunters and Cyber Demons are fairly similar in terms of how they are designed. Both change their approach to attacking the player based on the proximity of the player to them, much like the Marauder from Doom Eternal. One criticism I've seen levied at the Dark Ages over the past couple of weeks is how it's ironic that the most hated enemy from Eternal is mechanically more represented in this game, and this criticism is a bit of a false equivalence fallacy. The Marauders in Eternal force the player to play the game differently than how they'd grown accustomed to over the course of the game, and is in discordance with the aerial focus of the title. Now, I like this personally because it throws a wrench into the combat puzzle of Eternal. However, the Marauder in Eternal and the melee prompting Cyber Demon and Agadon Hunter in the Dark Ages are not the same thing at all. From its foundations, the Dark Ages is pushing the player to be within melee range or just outside of it, so it doesn't actually change the play pattern of the game for Cyber Demons and Agadon Hunters to mechanically prompt the player to come in close. What they do that is similar to the Marauder, however, is that they throw a wrench into the combat puzzle framework of the Dark Ages murder rooms. Cyber Demons and Agadon Hunters will mess the player up, mucking up all of their plans and dreams if ignored, so when they are present, they force the player either to separate themselves from these titanic terrors by breaking line of sight, which is counter to the thesis of the Dark Ages gameplay systems, or to come in close and deal with their parry-centered gameplay focus while also dealing with ranged attacks from behind, some of which must needs be parried. In both cases, the Cyber Demon and Agadon Hunter are overall positive inclusions in the Dark Ages, just like the Marauder is an important and nice addition to Eternal's Infernal roster. The Vagary, Mancubus, Pinky, and both versions of Arachnotron contrast heavily with the design of the Cyber Demon and Agadon Hunter. Each of these demons demand the player engage with them from medium distance to parry specific projectiles. An aspect of Doom gameplay not oft discussed is the threat prioritization players naturally do as they play the game. In every Doom game, there's typically an easy answer as to which demon should be dealt with first. For example, Archviles and Pain Elementals are enemy numero uno in classic Doom. However, in the Dark Ages, threat assessment is a bit more ambiguous and will lead to different players dealing with select murder rooms in different ways. I've noticed this already just from watching multiple reviews of this game. LGR, G-Man Lives, Totally Tubular Jonathan, the IGN guy, and loads of others all approached the game in different ways, leading to conflicting opinions regarding the design of certain enemies and the viability of each weapon. The juxtaposition of these mid-range demons with the close-range ones creates combat scenarios where there isn't necessarily one clear, correct avenue for success. And these two archetypes of enemy design are muddied even further with the Hell Knight, Cosmic Baron, Komodo, Whiplash, Lost Souls, Stone Imps, and Imp Stalkers, which are all hyper-aggressive, running the player down and, at times, forcing them to evade. This promoted play pattern is incompatible with the ones prompted by the previous two archetypes of demon design, and it is this set of demons that makes the shield bash such an important mobility tool. If the player is ever fighting a cyber demon only to be interrupted by a cosmic baron or Komodo, the shield bash is essentially the only way to secure a safe escape. The most dangerous of this particular style of demon are definitely the cosmic baron and Komodo, which can outline the player in chalk with 2 swift strikes on Nightmare. This type of gameplay is complicated even more when regular zombies, shield enemies, hell tanks, revenants, cacodemons, and acolytes are shooting the player from a distance, forcing the player to manage the bullet hell flurry of projectiles they spawn while also managing their immediate threats. As I stated before, revenants even go incorporeal, necessitating the player either parry their missiles, wait for them to corporealize, or kill them before they have a chance to be annoying. It's fitting then that most of these have hard counters, such as how a thrown shield counters the physical shield enemies and a volley of energy blasts counters the energy shield opponents. Tanks are destroyed with a single well-timed parry, making the pedagogy behind the design of these long-range enemies clear. They exist as a subtle distraction for the player to handle, and they don't exist to dominate the entirety of the player's attention. The cacodemons and acolytes are the high-tier threats in this category, as they each have a fairly beefy vitality paired with the propensity to stay at extreme distance. The combination of these close, medium, and long-range enemies is a genius bit of design and does make certain murder rooms in this game particularly challenging to best. It's also a good demonstration of the design value these demonic combinations have that, upon repeat play through certain levels, which I needed to do to mop up the collectibles I'd missed, I found murder rooms that gave me a lot of trouble earlier much easier the second time through. This is partially the result of a bigger health bar, better weapon upgrades, and the dread mace, sure, but since I would leave some of these without getting hit once, there is an element of hidden learning that happens here. One of the biggest reasons I love boomer shooters, character action games, and other genres of that ilk is because of how they use difficulty modes and modifiers as a scaffolding tool to get players up to a higher level of skill and readiness for greater levels of challenge. Within the context of Nightmare difficulty and reduced parry windows, the Dark Ages lands perfectly within my zone of proximal development. For those of you who don't know anything about Vygotskian education theory, there are 3 zones of learning growth. Number 1, the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. Number 2, zone of actual development, or ZAD. And number 3, the zone of frustration, or ZOF. When the difficulty modes in a game are well designed, they allow the player to maintain their zone of proximal development, where the challenge is just right for them. Not too easy, but just hard enough to push the player. When difficulty modes are bad is when they railroad the player into their zone of actual development, or the level of skill they're currently at, where they will find the game to be too easy and won't actually learn anything from the experience. This often leads to games feeling unremarkable, but not offensively bad, in terms of their difficulty systems. The zone of frustration is the tricky one because it can be triggered by a player just not being skilled enough for the game, or because the designers completely messed up their difficulty scaling. The Dark Ages lands perfectly in the zone of proximal development, which is exactly where all games should be to ensure a positive reflection on the overall experience of the title. And the genius of the Dark Ages difficulty design is how it promotes this zone of proximal development for every player that picks it up, which contrasts with the difficulty design of Eternal, which often placed players in their zone of frustration. This scaffolding design impacts the way challenges are given to the player. Over the course of the game, players are given a new mechanic or weapon and given time to learn how it should be used before being tested on what they've learned, typically through a boss fight or a leader encounter. Each of the major demons in this game can be upgraded to leader status, which basically means they're invincible until the player has killed a certain threshold of demons. Once that threshold has been reached, the leader can now be dealt damage. However, they'll still spawn in new threats and are a souped up version of the base demon type. This means that not only is the difficulty balanced based on Vygotskian theory, but also with a scaffolding framework, which is genius. This is why difficulty design is so important, and part of the reason the oversimplification of video games recently has created a bit of an easiness epidemic. The Dark Ages designers skirt around this problem by actually carefully tuning the design of their difficulty framework and systems, and this care, attention, and quality extends to the level design of the game. 。 While the level design in the Dark Ages isn't the literal best I've seen in a boomer shooter, it is quite good and a cut above other FPS titles, boomer shooter or not, on the market. Essentially, there are 3 archetypes of levels in this game. 1, the standard Doom fare, with corridors, looping level design, and carefully crafted murder rooms. 2, open level areas, giving the player the freedom of choice on how they want to engage with the gameplay systems and exploration aspects of the Dark Ages. And 3, levels that blend these 2 archetypes of design with the Atlan mech and dragon sections. The first and third of these are easy to analyze with one sentence: they are well done. The typical Doom design levels are nicely constructed even if they aren't as creative as the ones in Eternal or 2016's Doom. This does come down a bit to the gameplay framework of the Dark Ages, which definitely emulates classic Doom in terms of its horizontal focus. On its own, they are less exciting than what's come before, but in conjunction with the game's systems, they line up perfectly with what the Dark Ages is going for. The real difference between the Dark Ages and previous games are the open layout levels, where the player is dropped into a zone and are free to roam, murder, and collect at their own pace and to their heart's own content. These levels actually remind me somewhat of the more open levels in Halo Combat Evolved, and do seem like the natural evolution of that sort of Halo level design. Each of these stages are where a vast majority of the upgrade materials are hosted, and something else I quite like about the Dark Ages is how there are more materials than the player actually needs to upgrade everything. The only exception to this are the Wraith Stones, of which there are only the exact number needed to max everything out within the whole game. This does mean that a player not liking these levels is going to lead them to either not 100%ing a playthrough or otherwise reducing their ability to upgrade weapons, which is going to harm their overall impression of the title. But I don't think this is a design flaw. No game can cater to every single player under the sun, and if such a game did exist, it'd probably be so milquetoast that it'd be instantly forgotten. The design aspect of these levels that is worth criticizing though is the god-awful checkpointing. Oftentimes the checkpoint in a level is right before picking up a skull key, or right before clearing out a room to be able to return to the more open sections of any particular stage. It only takes one time of picking up a skull key and literally running across the whole map to die to one mistake before the checkpointing of these stages begins to stand out as a serious design flaw. At times, I would intentionally save sections of stages I theorized would yield a checkpoint until after I'd completed certain tasks, like picking up keys or clearing out small groups of enemies protecting a lever or something like that, because I didn't want to have to rewatch the pickup animations or refight demon groupings that are little more than a stopgap to my real goal and the real challenge of the level. This is something I hope id patches later down the line by adding a save option. There's no reason why a player shouldn't be able to save wherever they want, exactly where they are. That being said, the devil's advocate of this argument is that it is sometimes a positive that a modern game would add punishment to failure. Difficulty and punishment are two sides of the same coin, and both need to resonate with one another. Games with extreme difficulty get obnoxious quickly if failure is super punishing. Likewise, games of medium challenge get interesting when failure yields extreme punishment. The truly hardcore gamers are masochists after all. High-frequency fail states without any degree of punishment don't feel as satisfying to get by as one that does punish the player to some degree, such as how Mega Man games force the player to restart a level if they game over. As an additional example, Alien Isolation would be a far worse game if saving didn't work the way it does. It's important to the design of that game that saving is restricted, and for this reason the checkpointing, as is, may be beneficial to the design of the Dark Ages. I can see both sides of this issue, and if it weren't for the sections where death leads to a 2-minute jaunt across the level with no recourse to shorten that time frame and no interesting challenge in between, I'd actually be on the side of the latter. I'd be remiss to talk about the level design in this game without sharing my favorite and least favorite ones. My favorite missions are the following: Chapter 6 Siege Part 1, Chapter 13 From Beyond, Chapter 18 Belly of the Beast, Chapter 21 The Final Battle, and Chapter 22 Reckoning. The consistent thread across the first 3 of these levels is how they have some of the most fun murder rooms and combat challenges in the game. I particularly like the specific Mancubus Leader Challenge on From Beyond, where the player has to fight Arachnotrons, a Cacodemon, a Battle Knight, an Armored Pinky, and a Whiplash, essentially at the same time in a tight little area, all while the leader Mancubus is raining down damage over time acid pools that function as a bit of CC or crowd control on the player. Other murder rooms, such as the optional one that takes takes place in the Old One's stomach in Belly of the Beast are super challenging, and I appreciate them for that reason. I was always set up to like Belly of the Beast too, since I particularly enjoy levels in games that take place in the body of a much larger being. Honestly, it's probably because I played Ape Escape as a kid. Dexter's Island just hits differently in that game. I enjoy chapters 21 and 22 because they are levels that include the actual boss fights of the game. However, that aspect of their design is something I'll go deeper into in the next section. Reckoning does have some awesome combat scenarios, which does make it stand out more than the final battle though. It's hard for me to select levels I didn't like in the Dark Ages, but if a gun was put to my head, I'd have to say Chapter 14 Spire of Nerethul and Chapter 15 City of Rayl, because even though I love the Lovecraftian look of these levels, I don't like the water traversal parts, which are better done in classic Quake. There are some nice details in this level, such as how all of the eyes in City of Rayl follow the player, including while underwater. The pacing of these particular levels is just a bit off, and while I wouldn't call either bad, they are definitely the ones that stand out as being the least fun of the 22 available levels. All in all, the Dark Ages level design, while perhaps not being the greatest in the whole franchise, complements the gameplay mechanics in ways that make up for a lower level of creative geometry and intriguing layouts. While gameplay, difficulty, and level design are definitely the most important elements of a boomer shooter, modern Doom games also have two more categories worth talking about: boss fights and the story. Let's start with the boss fights. There are a decent number of boss fights in this game, however most of them are not unique. Doom 2016 has 3 unique boss fights and Eternal has the same number. The Dark Ages has 4 unique boss fights, but that is stretching the definition of unique a bit. Starting in Chapter 20 Resurrection, the player is beset upon by a string of boss fights. At the end of Resurrection, the player fights Krieg Maker. This fight is a pretty cool 2-phase encounter. The first phase is the teaching one, where the player is introduced to all of the core mechanics Krieg Maker uses. In the second, the difficulty is touched up a bit and other wrenches are thrown into the mix, such as these damaging circle zones the player has to avoid. This fight isn't as interesting as Con Maker, but honestly I wouldn't want it to be. Con Maker is the most powerful of her species, other than perhaps Summer Maker, so Krieg Maker should truly feel like the weakest of the 3, and he does. Interestingly enough, I made a new connection between how Krieg Maker looks during his glory kill animation and the Scrag from Quake. Looking at these two side by side, the Maker look like a redesigned version of the Scrag to me, almost like an evolved or technologically advanced version of them. That'd be an intriguing connection between Doom and Quake if so. The second boss fight is the only Atlan mech boss fight in the game, and it's against the Old One of those Lovecraftian monsters that appear throughout the game, this time with cybernetic hell enhancements. This is honestly the best part of the Atlan mechanic, taking everything the player has been exposed to over the course of the game and putting it all together in one final summative assessment. That being said, the Atlan and Dragon sections of the game are the Dark Ages' weakest elements, and this boss fight doesn't change that, even if it is a cool part. The third boss fight is against Enhanced Azrak, and this fight is genuinely awesome. It forces the player to properly parry nearly all of the boss's attacks in order to be successful, all while maintaining a constant sustained flow of damage via ranged shots and melee strikes. With the reduced parry window I played with, I found some of his attacks difficult to keep up with at times, and since he kills in 2 to 3 hits, this made Enhanced Azrak a nice bit of challenge to close out the campaign, or at least that's what he should have been. Now don't get it twisted, I like the design of the last level, Reckoning, including even the dual boss fight against the Witch and a powered down Azrak. However, this hardly feels like a satisfying conclusion to the Doom Dark Ages experience. I wouldn't actually get rid of this 4th boss fight or anything like that, but I would have restructured how these 2 levels were organized. First, I would have taken the regular Doom level design portion of Reckoning and put it at the beginning of Chapter 21, capping that level off with the Atlan boss fight against the Old One. Then, I would have made Chapter 22 a boss rush against the 5 phases of Azrak, starting with the dual fight against him and the Witch. I also would have just flip-flopped the names of Chapter 21 and 22 so that the final level of the game was actually titled The Final Battle. All of these boss fights are a fun time, however, Krieg Maker is a lesser version of Khan and Samur Maker. The old one boss fight is just a mechanically broadened Atlan punch-out fest, and the third and fourth boss fights are just two renditions of Azrak's mechanics, making it really feel like there are only two distinct boss fights in this game, even if there are technically four. Juxtaposing the Dark Ages with Eternal in 2016 in this sense does make the extra mechanically different boss fights in those games stand out way more, and this element of the Dark Ages is definitely one of my biggest disappointments with the title, especially since the parry framework and general gameplay is so strong. There is definitely design space for more complex and interesting boss fights, which is something I hope id does add to the game should they make expansions. Aside from these, there are loads of mini-boss encounters in this game, including the first encounter the player has with a Vagary, Agadon Hunter, and Komodo Demon. The leader variants and combat scenarios in general are way cooler, but I also don't really count any of these as distinct boss fights, especially since all three of these demons are fairly common throughout the game. While the boss fight suite of the Dark Ages is definitely lackluster, the things I am most disappointed with are the story, atmosphere, and vibes of this game. Quite simply, the Dark Ages does not look like a Doom title. The environments are distinctly not within that realm of an advanced human civilization that had stumbled across hell that has framed the setting of every other Doom game. This shift in environment was foreshadowed in Eternal with all of the levels that involve the remnants of the Night Sentinels. However, these are my least favorite levels aesthetically in Eternal for the same reason I'm disappointed with this environment shift in the Dark Ages. I'm not the first to say it, but the Dark Ages feels closer to the first Quake game than a Doom title. It's not just the environments either, as the weapons are distinctly Quake-coded too. I mean, Quake is where the nail gun comes from, and as such, the Dark Ages should have been a Quake reboot. The thing with this is that they would literally have to change nothing but replace the Doom skin and theming with Quake. That's how close in tonality and environment design these two games are. This is why the second half of this video's title is about how the Dark Ages is a missed opportunity. As such, I wouldn't be shocked to learn that the Dark Ages started out in the concept phase as a Quake reboot, which is something id Software fans have been clamoring for ever since Doom 2016 proved there is space in the modern gaming landscape for these classic FPS franchises. This is a criticism of mine that may not age well though, as I suspect there is a good possibility that id could be priming their modern audience for a Quake return and be trying to put Quake into a shared universe canonically with Doom and Wolfenstein, almost like a unification of the id Software unholy trinity. That explained why they changed the Doomslayer's yell to sound more like Rangers. The prospect of getting a game that is the middle ground between Eternal, which far better matches the gameplay flow of Quake, and the Dark Ages, which has the right vibes and weapon suite, is exciting and something I hope is actually its intention. If so, I hope we finally get rocket jumping back. Like, that's a classic bit of movement tech that really just doesn't show up in a lot of modern AAA FPS games anymore. The castles and Lovecraftian horrors present in the Dark Ages work naturally better with Quake, and it does make me wonder if this connection is why they redesigned the Cacodemons to look distinctly more Lovecraftian. Otherwise, I'll never be able to forgive what they've done to my boy.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Cacodemons have been my legit favorite thing in the Doom franchise since I was a kid, so I will say I was set up to be biased against the redesign of these guys. This is truly all conjecture and theory crafting with, at best, circumstantial evidence, so for now I'm going to limit myself to just critiques of the story as is right at this moment in time. Simply put, the story in the Dark Ages is too involved and heavy-handed. This is a series that doesn't need cutscene cutaway type storytelling, especially since it truly is the most boring element of the game and something I personally won't be looking at again after concluding this review except to refresh myself for whatever expansions release in the future. I don't care about these characters, and this doesn't feel like Doom. It's too fantasy and too disconnected from Wolfenstein. I mean, BJ Blazkowicz and Doomguy are supposed to be related. Additionally, Doomguy was better when he was just a pissed off murder machine that didn't talk, and him having a voice has been a net negative to his characterization since it happened in Eternal. And I know, he doesn't talk much and utters like like one word in this game, but that's really all it takes to break down the character that is established in Dooms 1 through 3 and 2016. Watch the cutscenes of 2016's Doom back to back with Eternals and the Dark Ages, and they just aren't the same character. The Doom Slayer's characterization is entirely shown to the player rather than told in 2016's Doom, and for most of the time in Eternal. However, the Dark Ages truly does sideline the character a bit in favor of these other ones that I couldn't actually name off the top of my head if you asked me to. The whole approach of adding in the old ones and this Cthulhu-esque dimension just doesn't work for Doom either in my book. The addition of the Makers and Night Sentinels is not bad, but the Dark Ages kinda jumps the shark in terms of expanding the lore of the series. Let me put this into perspective to explain what I mean. The 2005 Doom film, while not being a great Doom product and being a super cheesy B-tier quality movie, has the right idea for a Doom story. The film is analogous to a toddler picking up a glass of water to drink, tilting it too much and spilling it, basically dumping it on themselves. In this way, the film has the right idea, but the overall execution is just not good. Juxtaposing this with Eternal and the Dark Ages, the writing of the 2005 film, which just to reiterate is super flawed, is better and matches the vibes of Doom 3, the game it is trying to emulate. Eternal's edition of the Makers is good, as it essentially creates a techno heaven to complement techno hell, making it feel like a natural progression for the series to go in. These are entities based on deity ideas though, and that's not what cosmic horror stuff, like the Lovecraftian stuff in this game, works well with. There's a reason the gap between Quake and the Doom and Wolfenstein combo has never been bridged. It's not naturally compatible with the vibes, atmosphere, and story progression of those two franchises. Quake 2 would be a more natural fit, but that's not the direction this game seems to be setting up. Why they didn't continue with the framework established in Doom 2016 is lost on me, because that game has the right idea and the right execution for a Doom story. The Dark Ages even calls back to the beginning of the 2016 game in Chapter 19. This is all before even touching the fact that the Doom Slayer literally dies in this game and has to escape from an afterlife that is a weird cross between the River Styx from Greek mythology, with even a Charon-esque gatekeeper, and Helheim from 2018's God of War. This is just not the right way to take Doom's story, but to be quite frank, I don't actually care that much. The story of these games definitely falls more in line with Carmack's eternalized quote, and just needs to be set dressing to get the player invested in the gameplay. And the Dark Ages is successful in this regard. I don't give scores at the end of my reviews. Instead, I'll answer the question, will Doom the Dark Ages be making my top 100 of the 2020s? Doom the Dark Ages will be making my top 100 of the 2020s, and it'll be entering the list in the red category. Games in my various top 100 lists are categorized as red or blue, with red tier games being the ones that are immune from being removed at least for a while. I like the game better than the base game of Eternal, and it may even take the position as my favorite game of the decade so far over Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3. But I'd like for this game to age another year or so before I settle into an opinion of that scope. There's definitely too much risk of recency bias to put this game that high up at this time. It is definitely my game of the year at this point in time, although that may even change by the end of the year since I'm gearing up to play Expedition 33 right now and Ghost of Yotei later this year, both games of which could very well beat this one out. Beyond the story and a few minor design quibbles, this game just hits perfectly for me, and as such I have to recommend it to everyone except the people who are exclusively Doom Eternal fans. To be honest, those of you who fit into that category would be better served playing the original Quake than picking this up, because it'll match the more frantic pacing of Eternal better than the Dark Ages can. However, for every Doom fan who likes all of the games, or the FPS fans looking for a palate cleansing break from Fortnite or whatever live service thing they've been playing, the Dark Ages is the perfect game for them and comes with my biggest recommendation. And that's the video, my guys. What do you all think about the direction the Doom series is taking with the Dark Ages? What do you all think of my analysis? Let's discuss everything Doom and id Software in the comments below, and while you're down there, do me a solid by smashing that like button, subscribing, and ringing the notification bell. If you like this video, you may like my other and future work, including one of the videos on the screen. Next Friday, I'll be ranking every Doom game from worst to best, and you won't want to miss out on that. Regardless of what you choose to do, thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games. Have an awesome day, my friend.